Thank you so much, Maureen. And hello, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be joining you today to kick off this year's UC Imagine Fest. And I am even more excited that the theme of the day is cleaning the climate. What an important and timely topic, especially given the context of COP26 having taken place over the past 2 weeks. So, a month ago or so, when Maureen reached out to me to inquire about my interest in speaking at tonight's event, it was honestly the easiest question I've ever had to answer. Not because her invitation came on the heels of a public initiative related to climate innovation that I was spearheading for work, which admittedly would have been reason enough to be here tonight. But the real reason for my enthusiasm was because I relate so much to what you all are hoping to accomplish socially, environmentally, and economically during this marathon event. And because I relate to the foundation that you all are drawing from as you explore what it means to innovatively and creatively clean the climate. A foundation that you and I share based on our unique experiences at Ursinus. To be honest, I really can't think of a more Ursinus career than the one that I have today. As Maureen mentioned, I am a contracted gender, climate, and innovation policy advisor at the US Department of State here in Washington, DC. And yes, between my move to DC and my years at Ursinus, I did earn a PhD in chemistry and materials science from Princeton. But it is not that Princeton degree that has truly prepared me for my day-to-day life, helping to shape US foreign policy. To be honest with you, I sometimes feel like my life is a sitcom. Big Bang Theory, Parks and Recreation, Schitt's Creek, take your pick. My character is the woman scientist who finds herself in the male-dominated federal government working on the intersection of women's issues and climate change. Yeah, that legitimately sounds like a Leslie Knope storyline if Parks and Rec were rebooted today. But there is a reason that my story isn't actually that of a sitcom character, why it's real life. And that reason is a strong appreciation for and knowledge of interdisciplinarity, something instilled in me not at the State Department, not at Princeton, but at Ursinus. In fact, as someone who took a sharp turn from liberal arts as an undergraduate to an Ivy League doctoral program in the sciences, it's a real pet peeve of mine when scientists in particular talk about how interdisciplinary their work is when they're collaborating between physical chemistry and organic chemistry, or even between chemistry and biology, or really any two scientific fields. That collaborative research is important, of course, but it's more important for the long game of science than it is for the short game of addressing our most pressing global challenges. You can't solve climate change or COVID-19 by simply combining two scientific disciplines. You need diversity of thought, diversity of experiences, and diversity of academic backgrounds. Science must intersect with all other fields, which was something I really tried to underscore during my time at the Innovation and Discovery Center grand opening just a few years ago. But, why is this quote unquote real interdisciplinarity so crucial? To answer that question, I think we need to examine the challenge that we're all here to talk about today, climate change. What does combating the climate crisis, as we like to say in my line of work, actually mean? It means addressing each individual problem a changing climate poses to society, including, as just a few examples, challenges to our health, economy, community infrastructure, food systems, and none of these are purely scientific. So it would be frankly naive to think that science alone can provide all the solutions. Climate change is a scientific phenomenon affecting parts of society that are only partially rooted in science, and that's on a good day, which makes the interdisciplinary education and opportunities available at Ursinus so critical as we find solutions that are actually effective. Each and every one of you is positioned to leverage your expertise and your story to generate those solutions. And that brings me back to my story, which is one of about a million paths you can take to put that interdisciplinarity into action in your years to come. When I graduated from Ursinus in May 2015, I walked away with a double major in chemistry and biology and a French minor because it's Ursinus and why not? But I also left with foundational experiences that prepared me for a career related to science in society. One of those experiences was being a fellow of the Parley Center for Science and the Common Good, which helped me consider the tangible and intangible ways in which science interacts with the world at large. I'd say that applies to working on science adjacent policy in the government. And the other key experience was competing in the first entrepreneurial competition hosted by the UImagine Center, which taught me the true meaning of innovation. Now, innovation is literally part of my job title. As a gender, climate, and innovation policy advisor, I work in the State Department's Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, which we call SGW for short. And I'll tell you a secret. Another thing that Ursinus taught me was to be good at acronyms, which has served me really well since working in government. But anyway, I develop SGW's priorities in policy, programming, and outreach that sit at the intersection between gender issues and climate change. Now, when I was first offered the job and I told my family about it, my mom gave me a confused look and asked very genuinely, "What intersection?" Fast forward, and it turns out that she was only the first of maybe 50 people that would end up asking me that very same question in the intervening months, and interdisciplinarity provides the answer. Climate change is considered a cross-cutting issue here in SGW, and that's because it influences just about every gender-specific policy priority that exists in our office. So let me try to explain what some of those priorities are while answering my mom's question. What is the gender climate nexus? I personally like to divide it into three categories. One, conflict and state fragility. Two, health and human rights. And three, innovation and entrepreneurship. The first category, conflict and state fragility, recognizes that the impacts of climate change will increase the risk of displacement, migration, and conflict, especially in regions of the world that already suffer from instability. These outcomes may be triggered by extreme weather events or natural disasters, but they can also be induced by food insecurity, water scarcity, or degradation of natural resources. It turns out that in many parts of the world, women and girls are most reliant on these natural resources and are more likely to be responsible for procuring food, water, and firewood for sustenance or livelihood purposes. Additionally, traditional coping mechanisms to climate stressors often come at the expense of women and girls, like how small livestock, which are usually under women and girls' purview, are the first assets to be liquidated in a climate emergency. Women and children will also comprise the majority of people who will be forced to migrate as a result of climate stressors in the years to come. So that's the first intersectional area between gender and climate. The second, once again, involves health and human rights, a theme I would expect to resonate strongly on a campus like Ursinus and in a building like the IDC. So when climate-related disasters strike, economic and educational opportunities are jeopardized, and healthcare services are often lost. And I'll give you one guess as to who in society is most likely to suffer from those losses. It's the women and girls. We saw this with COVID, actually. When someone had to stay home for the sake of the family, it was usually women sacrificing their jobs or their education. And that wasn't here in the United States, too, not just the developing world. We actually expect similar results, especially in the developing world, as the climate crisis worsens and as women and girls need to travel to further or unfamiliar destinations to procure those scarce food and water supplies. That, by the way, also increases their risk of experiencing gender-based violence, or GBV, out in the world or even in temporary shelters put in place following natural disasters. Here's one more sobering example. When resources are scarce, families are more likely to feel pressured to force their girls into childhood marriages because they just don't see another option when they already don't have enough resources to go around. So that's the quick version of the gender and climate category related to health and human rights. Now, the third category, innovation and entrepreneurship, is by comparison a glimmer of hope, a bright spot in an otherwise disheartening conversation. This category recognizes the need to ensure that women and girls have the training, mentorship, and financing needed to work or lead in the green and blue economies that are becoming ever important as we seek to improve the sustainability of just about every industrial sector. Now, at this point in the conversation, I've genuinely had people look at me and say, duh, why wouldn't women and girls have those opportunities? And I have to remind them that, as we've seen in myriad fields, STEM fields included, if we aren't proactive about women's participation and leadership in these emerging economies, we can't actually feel confident that it'll just happen. Consider the fact that some countries restrict women from working in certain sectors, and other countries fail to grant women the right to own land. In many developed nations, less formal, more systemic barriers exist, which may contribute to the reason why women comprise only 32% of the renewable energy sector jobs. And that's a newer sector where gender roles and expectations should theoretically be far less entrenched. So now that I've given you the SparkNotes version of the gender climate nexus, I want to tell a hypothetical story to demonstrate these intersections in practice. Imagine a young woman from northern Brazil. She's neither rich nor poor, and the town that she lives in sits on a major river delta near the coast. She's lived there her entire life, but in recent years, she's noticed things beginning to change. Her community only flooded once or twice when she was growing up, but now it floods every time it rains. The flooding has gotten so bad that local drinking water supplies have been contaminated. Saltwater intrusion, it's called. So the woman quits her job to spend her days fetching potable water for her family. But that's not all. Soon her entire community is forced to make the difficult decision to move further inland. But it takes a while to rebuild your community from the ground up. And the woman loses access to the family planning services that she had back home, because those certainly aren't the first services put in place in a brand new community, right? After all the turmoil associated with relocating and restarting her life, she doesn't feel like she could responsibly have a child right now. But without those health services, that choice becomes chance. She recognizes she can't be the only woman in the community worried about this, though. She ends up creating a grassroots organization consisting of all the women in her community, and they partner with an NGO to ensure that sexual and reproductive health services are put in place faster and more effectively. She experienced a disproportionate impact of climate change, and she created a solution to one of those impacts. So that story, of course, is hypothetical, but it is based on very real outcomes of the climate crisis that have been recorded around the world. And I'm not going to get into the fact today that restrictive gender norms make women and girls 14 times more likely to die as a result of natural disasters, including climate-related ones, because, well, that's a soapbox you just don't want to see me step on right now. But this gender climate nexus, in all of its complexity, does demonstrate a two-pronged approach for how we must take action, whether that be through governments, civil society, private sector, or NGOs. On the one hand, we must address the disproportionate impacts of climate change on women, girls, and marginalized communities. On the other hand, we must recognize that due to their relationship with their families, communities, and the environment, women and girls are uniquely poised to develop really effective, locally relevant solutions to climate challenges, and they must be empowered as leaders to do so. And while I'm at it, another community that's in a position to lead the change? Youth, which includes college-age people, by the way. Youth communities have the ability to make changes and implement interventions to shape the world that they want to live in 10, 20, and 50 years down the line. So my work involves helping to develop foreign policy goals and advising foreign assistance programming to put this two-pronged approach into practice, overcoming disproportionate climate impacts and facilitating women and girls' leadership in the climate arena. This involves a lot of coordination with different State Department bureaus, like the ones that focus on economic issues, human rights issues, or different geographic regions, as well as the White House and our embassies around the world. I also serve as a resource to help these other entities understand the gender climate nexus and how to seamlessly incorporate it into the work they're already doing. Because since Climate action and gender equity and equality are two major priorities of this administration. It's something that every single one of my colleagues has to think about. But that's really policy heavy. And policy, admittedly, isn't always the fastest way to see impact, especially when we're trying to help maximize the impact of women and girls in their own communities. Outreach can play an important role here, which is something I've tried to facilitate through the SGWE initiative that Maureen mentioned called the Innovation Station. The Innovation Station amplifies women and girl innovators who are developing these local solutions to climate-related challenges. And we do that through a virtual event series that reaches audiences around the country and around the world. Now, the key here is identifying local solutions that are translatable and could therefore prove useful in other communities in the United States or globally. Consider, for example, efforts to merge scientific and indigenous knowledge sources to better prevent and respond to wildfires, or projects to help local fisheries improve their social and environmental sustainability, or initiatives that merge art and agriculture to improve urban food security. These are all real examples of women-led endeavors that have not only had a role in building resilience locally, but could be immensely impactful in other locations too. So we give these women and girls a platform to talk about their efforts, and then we help them connect with those other communities to share best practices or even implement their innovative solutions on the ground. The Innovation Station as a project, I think, is interesting because it helps people draw parallels between the climate-related challenges they're facing in their own communities and similar challenges faced elsewhere in the world. And this is really only possible because the impacts of climate change are so regionally specific. Consider that impacts on the East Coast, as one example, might differ from those in the West Coast of the United States, but they might be similar to climate challenges in the Pacific Islands or South Asia. The magnitude of our climate crisis can feel desperate and isolating, but identifying these shared challenges and building new geographically disparate communities to tackle them can provide tangible results and a sense of hope simultaneously. Communities that generate and implement solutions at the local level from the ground up or from the campus up will play a critical role in climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience in the years to come. And helping those communities or campuses help one another is an innovative approach to addressing climate change that will pay dividends on a global scale. And so as I begin to wrap up, that really brings me back to what I think is a critical question here today. What is innovation anyway? As I mentioned early on in this discussion, it was a definition that became clearer to me throughout my involvement with the UImagine Center in its early days. You see, during that entrepreneurial competition on campus back in 2014, my teammates and I proposed the development of a global infectious disease tracking database. And no, the irony of that is not lost on me as we trudge through year 2 of a pandemic, also less than 10 years after I took Tony Lobo's class called Pandemic Preparedness, by the way. In any case, our proposal sought to combine cloud-based real-time data aggregation with geolocation, disease information, and cultural competency to address the needs of doctors, researchers, and patients alike. It was a cool idea, if I do say so myself, and it was vouched for by public health experts, but none of what we were proposing was exactly new. Data aggregation, geolocation, and medical tips in and of themselves, they weren't new concepts, but the way we sought to combine and use them was. We had identified an inefficiency in the way disease tracking was being accomplished, and we devised a new way to do it. And that's when it clicked for me. Innovation isn't just a string of code, a fancy gadget, or a new technology. Innovation is finding better, more creative ways of solving problems, which involves learning from existing challenges, repurposing existing tools in our toolkit, and understanding local context. Innovation can be a program, a model, an initiative, or yes, even a technology. But what I hope to impress upon you is that sometimes non-technological solutions are more meaningful and more effective in getting a job done. Just think about that hypothetical Brazilian woman from our story earlier. She didn't need to design a new type of contraceptive. That wouldn't have even been helpful necessarily in her situation. In her case, what was helpful was a programmatic approach to improve healthcare accessibility. What it boils down to is this: ethical, inclusive, and sustainable action on climate change, or any other global challenge for that matter, starts by overturning the commonly held conception of what innovation is and changing the definition of who qualifies as an innovator. The idea that innovation is rooted in technology is exclusionary. It places innovation at the top of the ivory tower and confines it to an academic pursuit, one that's earmarked for doctoral degree wielding scientists and engineers. That's the opposite of inclusive, certainly not sustainable. And I'm sure my friend Kelly Sorensen would agree that it's probably not ethical either. Anyone can be an innovator, regardless of demographics, including educational level and field of study. Innovative solutions and strategies to overcome climate change must come from a diverse collection of innovators. And the strategies they develop can take many forms: for-profit companies, social enterprises, charitable endeavors, you name it. Whichever route an innovator chooses, whichever route you choose, must consider the needs and values of the target community. And in doing so, you'll hopefully also identify the needs of more vulnerable populations within that community and actively take steps to address them. And like the definition of innovation itself, consider adopting a broader perspective of community. After all, you never know how the climate solutions you develop here in the United States could change the lives of people in Nigeria or Kazakhstan, Palau or Moldova. It's a tall order, it's a lot for you to think about, but I know you can handle it because the entire ethos of Ursinus College has prepared you to think holistically, intersectionally, and innovatively to turn challenges like climate change into true opportunities. I typically like to end Ursinus related engagements like this one by conveying a piece of advice that was shared with me on the Ursinus campus. It was at the first ever guest lecture hosted by the Parley Center featuring Dr. Richard Heinzel of Doctors Without Borders. He explained to me the importance of serendipity, of luck, when it comes to pursuing one's career goals. I really took that to heart during my time at Ursinus, but based on my experiences in recent years, I prefer a slightly modified version as conveyed by the philosopher Seneca, who said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Well, Ursinus has given you that preparation, and today's Imagine Fest is your first opportunity. So good luck to you all, and I cannot wait to see what innovations you bring to the table. Thank you so much.
Aubrey, can we open it up for a few questions before they get started?
I would be honored, yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to open it up. And feel free to ask a question or two. Go ahead, Jake.
What made you choose to want to work in the government rather than like a third-party organization that kind of has the same mission as what you are doing currently with your job?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's something about recognizing where you feel like you can have the most impact, influence, and ultimately contribute the most good. And for me, that decision was the government, at least for the time being. There's also some strategy involved if you want to have global impact in whatever it is that you choose to do in your years to come. Understanding the systems that exist that you'll have to work within down the line, whether or not you are within those systems permanently. So for me, not only is working in the government giving me access to people and communities around the world that I would otherwise have a really hard time accessing and trying to help, but if I were to ever leave the government, I now have a functional understanding of how the State Department works, the whole interagency, which is really all the federal agencies and how they work together, the White House and the National Security Council, et cetera. And so that can only help me, when I try to work with the government moving forward, even if it's not from within the government. Great question.
Go ahead, son. You might have to speak up so Aubrey can hear.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh yeah. I'm Song. I'm a biochemistry major. So it was great to hear some familiar names like Lobo and Kelly. So you're double majoring in biology, chemistry, and minoring in French. And what made you? So it's kind of course it's our science. However, it's kind of out of your like major point of view. Your majors are mostly science based. Um, what what classes or incident made you think more about the structural side of problem solving instead of only science based solutions?
Yeah, so the funny thing is, I don't know if I would have um, picked out a variety of non-science classes beyond the core requirements if it wasn't for being a Parley Fellow. Because at least at the time, I obviously don't know if this is still the case, but Parley Fellows had to take 6 courses outside of their major. And the more outside of the major, the better, was sort of the vibe at the time. And so it was really my ethics classes with Kelly Sorensen. I took biomedical ethics and environmental ethics that really shaped a new perspective. I also took sociology of medicine and archaeology, a lot of more anthropological or behavioral science adjacent things. So they weren't science themselves, but they were easy to connect the dots. And between those classes and participating in the guest lectures and other events, internships, et cetera, that the Parley Center was putting on, that really helped me consider that science wasn't just a lab job anymore. It certainly can be, and that's important, but that's not all it has to be. And so I actually got really interested in science policy and science communication during my time at Ursinus. Before joining the State Department, I worked for a think tank, during Ursinus and through grad school, that the Parley Center introduced me to. It was a science policy think tank, and part of my work for them was actually developing their podcast. And the whole role of that podcast was to translate scientific topics to non-scientists and to take it one step further, connect it in an interesting way with policy decisions happening at the local, state, national, and international level. So those experiences, I think, really helped me to start looking beyond the lab, as I like to say, and shaped my trajectory moving forward. Now, I still did my PhD in chemistry and material science because I knew at that point that I wanted to do science in society work, so not necessarily in the lab, but I knew that I needed to be considered an expert in some area of science to do that. And so the only tip there is if this is something you're interested in and then you do go to grad school, make sure you find an advisor that is aware of your desire to explore things that are not exclusively professorships or industrial lab jobs, because having that support will be really important.
Thank you.
Of course.
One more question? Yes. You might have to come up to the microphone.
In your experience, do you think it would be best to gain work experience after college or go straight into grad school?
Oh, that's a tale as old as time question. My goodness. I don't think there is a one right path in that regard, which I know is probably not the answer you're looking for. I will say that people who choose to go and get work experience immediately after college sometimes get sidetracked and have a hard time then going back to school, especially if you're looking for a very lab-based program, so something in the sciences that might take 4 to 6 years. It can be hard to make that pivot from a 9-to-5 job back into an academic setting where you're kind of living in the lab. So if you were anticipating I guess if I had to boil down one piece of advice in that regard, it would be if you are considering a lab science graduate school degree, I would lean on the side of going straight to grad school if that works for you financially and in your family sense. But if you're considering grad school for something outside of the sciences, then you might be not better off, but more easily able to take some time in the workforce beforehand.
Any other questions? We have one more question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, just speak loudly.
Okay. What was your interest and career path going into Ursinus? And how did your experiences here change that over the course of being here?
That's a really fun one for me because there's a reason Richard Heinzel gave me that piece of advice about luck. And it was because when I met him, it was my sophomore year, early on in the fall. And I felt like I was surrounded by a bunch of students, my friends, who knew exactly what they wanted to do. They knew they wanted to be a doctor in this, this specialty type in this city at this hospital by the time they were, 35 years old. And I'm sitting there like, I like science, and so that's where that advice actually came from. And that's why it was so impactful to me, because I was really freaked out about that, not really knowing my direction. When I came to Ursinus, I came because of the strong science reputation. And I was the science fair kid in high school. So I knew I liked science. I knew I liked solving problems, devising experiments. And so I thought that I would figure it out as I went. So I thought I wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't know what that meant really until I started getting in the lab at Ursinus. So it was things like doing lab research as an undergraduate, and doing internships. So I did a couple of internships while I was at Ursinus, and taking advantage of the opportunities on campus that really exposed me to all the options. I mean, I used to say, even when I worked in the admissions office to students or prospective students, I used to say, sometimes it's just as valuable to find out what you don't like as it is to find out what you do. And then you can start putting the puzzle pieces together, knocking off certain options that weren't the right fit, and pushing up in your queue the things that worked out really well and that you really enjoyed. And then it just kind of fits together. Now, I will admit that, why did I go to grad school besides wanting the scientific expertise? My professors who were mentors to me felt that that was the next step for me, and I trusted them because they knew me so well, and so I went for it. And so there's no one right path. I get asked all the time how to get even to the State Department, and there's not one right path, right? Let alone everything you can do with the education you're getting and the background that you're getting at Ursinus that can be so broad if you want it to be. So I guess the short answer, the short version of that question is, I came in wanting to be a scientist. I left as a scientist with broader interests and pursued those in my years following.